Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to today's program as part of our One City, One Story book, Stealing Home from Pasadena Public Library's One City, One Story program by Eric Nussbaum. We're delighted that you're here today to listen to Dr. Peter Dreier talk about his two books. This is really quite the baseball season in Los Angeles, and I hope you all were able to watch the All-Star game last night. So a few little technical information before we start the program. Please mute yourself. Dr. Dreier will be presenting a PowerPoint, and it will be recorded, thanks to him, on YouTube Pasadena Library. You can enable live transcript if you would want to. And also put your questions, please, in chat after the program. Peter will answer all of your questions as well. We are delighted to say that we have both of Peter's books about the baseball. He has also written numerous other books, but today he's talking about his two baseball books that were just recently published, Baseball Rebels, The Players, People, and Social Movements that Shook Up the Game and Changed America, and Major League Rebels, Baseball Battles Over Workers' Right and American Empire. As I said, both of those books are available for you to check out from the Pasadena Public Library, and they're also available for purchase from Vroman's Bookstore. Peter is an American urban policy analyst, author, liberal commentator, and college political science professor. He is the Dr. E.P. Clapp Distinguished Professor of Politics at Occidental College in Los Angeles, California. He's been involved in urban policy as a scholar, government official, and reporter and advocate for more than 30 years. He's also a frequent speaker on these topics, and he's a co-author on 3 books about cities and urban policy, including The Next Los Angeles, The Struggle for a Livable City, 2005. As I said, he's professor at Occidental College. He's been there since 1993 after serving as housing director at the Boston Redevelopment Authority and senior policy advisor to Boston Mayor Ray Flynn. And it's the pleasure of the Pasadena Public Library to be able to introduce Dr. Peter Dreier to present today about his two books. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the library for having this book series and speaker series. Thanks to Tiffany Duenas and the library staff for doing the technical work to make it possible for people to participate and join. As Christine said, we had the All-Star game yesterday, and before the game started, there was a ceremony honoring both Jackie Robinson from Pasadena and his wife, Rachel Robinson, who turned 100 yesterday, 100 years old. And there's a lot written about Jackie Robinson and about his career. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, but I'm going to mostly talk about people you may never have heard of who played important roles, not only in baseball, but in the larger society in terms of bringing about social change, social justice, and fighting for a more humane and democratic society, as well as a baseball game that is more fair and democratic in its own way. Baseball is really part of our society. For many years, it's been called the national pastime, even though football and basketball in some ways have become equally popular. But when I was growing up, baseball was the national pastime. And, we can tell how influential baseball is in some ways from a lot of the phrases we use that come from baseball, but we now sort of take them for granted as just things that we say. We don't even think about the baseball connection. You threw me a curveball, or this is just a ballpark figure, or that idea was out of left field, or we're going to do this right off the bat, or you really struck out on that, or you really hit a home run about that, or you hit it out of the park. Those are all baseball metaphors and sayings that we use in our everyday lives. So I'm going to talk about baseball as part of our culture. And I would say the theme of of these two books that I wrote with my colleague, Rob Elias, which came out in April, the theme is that we love baseball as a game, and we love baseball as part of our culture, but we're not thrilled by the business side of baseball and some of the legacy of racism and imperialism, and battles over workers' rights and over gender. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to start with what I call before Jackie Robinson, baseball's civil rights movement. So almost everybody, particularly here in Pasadena, knows the story that, Jackie Robinson was the first player to break the color barrier in 1947. That Branch Rickey was the owner and general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he was the one that had the strategy and the instinct to figure out that it was time for baseball to integrate against the opposition of every other owner in Major League Baseball at the time. That's the story of these two trailblazers, Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey. And it's partly true, but it's mostly not true. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the not true part. Right? I'm going to start off with a guy named Octavius Catto, who was before and during the Civil War was kind of Martin Luther King, or one of the leaders of the Black community in the United States. He lived in Philadelphia. He was a civil rights leader. He was a friend of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. He was a teacher at one of the Black high schools in Philadelphia. This is in the 1850s and 1860s. He taught classics. He taught economics. He taught mathematics. He taught English. He was also a politician, and he fought for voting rights before the United States gave African Americans full citizenship. But he also was a great athlete and the star shortstop of a team that he started called the Black Pythians in Philadelphia. And what was unusual and interesting about Octavius Catto is that he used his all-Black baseball team as part of his struggle for racial justice. He insisted that his team be allowed to play in the white baseball leagues at the time in the 1850s and 60s, and they refused. And so then he said, well, okay, let's try to, I dare the white teams to play my team, the Pythians, an all-Black team. And at first they resisted. They didn't want to play against his team, but ultimately a couple of teams relented, and the Pythians won most of the games they played against white teams. Now, that might not seem like a big deal now, but at the time, when a lot of Americans believed that Blacks were both intellectually and physically inferior, there was a source of great pride and a source of a sense of empowerment that a Black baseball team could beat a white baseball team. And it generated a lot of news at the time. And Catto, not unexpectedly, became a very controversial figure. And he was organizing Black people to vote in the Philadelphia mayor's election in 1871. And you can see this drawing on the right-hand side in October of 1871, of where he was assassinated. Not only because he was encouraging people to vote, but because he was quite a well-known public figure at the time, and people resented his advocacy for equal rights. And so, long before Jackie Robinson, long before Branch Rickey, there were other people like Octavius Catto who were using baseball as part of the struggle for racial and social justice. Another were Moses Fleetwood Walker and Bud Fowler. Jackie Robinson was not the first Black player in the major leagues. These two guys, Moses Walker and Bud Fowler, played on all-white teams in what was then the major leagues in the 1880s. And they were accepted as black players on these mostly white teams. In fact, last year, Bud Fowler was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Now that the Baseball Hall of Fame is beginning to look back at early days of baseball and induct people who might otherwise not have been in there. But in 1889, this guy, Cap Anson, you can boo if you'd like. Cap Anson was probably the best player in the major leagues at the time. And he was a hardcore racist. And he refused to play. He was the manager and the leading player of the Chicago White Stockings, they were called, which was the predecessor to what's now called the Chicago White Sox. And Cap Anson, who's in the Hall of Fame because he was a great player, he was the one who initiated the segregation, the Jim Crow line, you might say, in professional baseball, when he, in the 1890s, when he refused to play with black players and said that he and his team would not take the field when Moses Fleetwood Walker or Bud Fowler were on the field. And so baseball began its official segregation because of Cap Anson in the late 1800s. So what happened is that the black community in the United States began to organize its own league, similar to what Octavius Catto had done in Philadelphia. And so the Negro Leagues were started in the 1920s, led by a guy named Rube Foster on the left, who was a star pitcher for several black professional teams, and began the Negro Leagues in 1920. And he became a highly successful manager and executive as well as a great pitcher. Apparently he taught John McGraw, the heralded manager of the New York Giants, asked Rube Foster to teach his star pitcher, a guy named Christy Mathewson, how to throw a curveball or a screwball. It's a little unclear which one. And so he was a great executive, a great entrepreneur, and a great player. And there was an alternative baseball league in America called the Negro Leagues, which I'll talk about a little more a bit later. And one of the star players in the 1920s was this guy on the right named Frank Sykes, who hardly anybody's ever heard of unless you read my book. He was a star pitcher in the Negro Leagues for several teams. He'd gone to Howard University. He got a degree. He was getting his degree to become a dentist. He lived in a small town in Alabama. And in the 1920s, there was a famous trial called the Scottsboro Boys trial, where 9 African-American teenagers were falsely accused and put on trial for raping 2 white women allegedly on a train. And, you know, there was no such thing as fair justice for black people in the criminal justice system in Alabama in the 1920s. And so they were found guilty without much evidence. Eventually, the 2 white women recanted, but they'd already spent time in prison. And as the trial went on appeal, the lawyer for the Scottsboro Boys, a guy from New York, came down to Alabama. And Frank Sykes was a leader in this little town outside of Scottsboro where the trial took place. And he testified that there were many black people in this area who should be on the jury if the Scottsboro Boys were going to get a fair trial. And there were no blacks on the jury, of course. And he testified publicly to that, which is an extremely courageous, brave thing to do. He knew at the time that he was risking his life. His house could have been burned down. He could have been lynched. His family could have been hurt. But he did it out of a sense of fairness. And then the Ku Klux Klan tried to burn down his house. And so he moved to Baltimore, where he had his dental practice until he died in the 1950s. And so he was a great pitcher in the Negro Leagues, but his claim to fame, from my point of view, was the bravery he showed during the Scottsboro Boys trial, which if you look online, you'll find a lot of books written about that trial. There's even a Broadway musical about it a couple years ago. So the Negro Leagues had some of the greatest athletes in America, but most white people from the 1920s to the 1950s had never heard of these great Negro players in the Negro Leagues, these black athletes. You know, the greatest ones were Satchel Paige, the pitcher on the bottom there, and Josh Gibson. Sometimes he was called the Black Babe Ruth, and people said no, Babe Ruth was the white Josh Gibson. And Oscar Charleston. There were many. Most of them never got to play in the majors. So Satchel Paige did in 1948 when he was brought up by the Cleveland Indians after Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. He was in his mid to late 40s. Nobody quite knows how old he was. So most of these black players were invisible to most white because the white newspapers didn't cover the Negro Leagues. Only the black newspapers and a few lefty white papers like the Daily Worker from the Communist Party covered the black players in the Negro Leagues. But those few really made a difference. And when Jackie Robinson was still in high school, or actually in middle school here in Pasadena, there began a movement to dismantle racial integration in racial segregation, in Major League Baseball. In 1933, these two guys, Haywood Broun, who was a syndicated columnist, and Jimmy Powers, probably the most powerful and widely read baseball columnist in the country for the New York Daily News, they gave a speech to the New York Baseball Writers Association and said, isn't it crazy that Joe Louis is the heavyweight champion and that Jesse Owens represented the United States in the Olympics along with other black players, but we don't let black players play in the national pastime. So they were two of the few white journalists who advocated for the desegregation of Major League Baseball back in the early 1930s. And again, long before Jackie Robinson came on the scene and long before Branch Rickey of the Dodgers had the idea to integrate baseball. But most of that crusade to integrate baseball was done by the black newspapers. And there were hundreds of black newspapers. Every city in America had its own black newspapers. Some of them were daily newspapers. And three of the most important sports writers for the black papers, which were called the Negro Press at the time, were Wendell Smith, Joe Bostic, and Sam Lacey, who were the sports writers and columnists for the Pittsburgh Courier, the Amsterdam News in New York, and the Washington Tribune and Baltimore Afro-American. That was Lacey's newspaper. They not only covered the Negro Leagues in their columns, but they also joined the movement to dismantle baseball's Jim Crow system. And I'll talk more about them in a second. Another one was Lester Rodney, who was the sports editor of the Communist Party's newspaper, the Daily Worker. And he was a great baseball fan and also obviously a radical. And he also believed in baseball should be integrated. And he would write columns about that. He, like the black writers that I mentioned earlier, he would interview white players and white managers and say, would you guys mind having black teammates? And to their surprise, most of them said, I wouldn't mind. It's the owners that are keeping the black players out of baseball. This was a column that he wrote, outlawed by baseball, the crime of the big leagues. And he was a very forthright and active participant in this movement to dismantle. One of the major figures in this was the commissioner of baseball, a guy named Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who had been a federal judge who was brought on to become the baseball commissioner, the first baseball commissioner in 1920. And he was an ardent segregationist. And he kept saying there's no rule against black people playing in baseball, but he was lying. And he made sure that if any of the owners wanted to even think about integrating, he would put the kibosh on that. But this movement continued, this agitation by unions, by civil rights groups, by Black newspapers, by leftists, by progressive politicians around the country. And in 1943, Paul Robeson, the great artist, activist, performer, singer, Broadway star, movie actor, he was brought to a meeting of the Major League Baseball owners in December 1943. It took place in Chicago. This is a photograph from a newspaper at that time. Wendell Smith is on the right. Two other sports writers are on the left. And he, along with the publishers of Black newspapers, met with the owners of Major League Baseball at this meeting in 1943. And he gave this eloquent speech, which is partly reproduced in my book, saying that if he could play Othello on stage as an African-American actor, then baseball ought to be able to integrate. And remember, this is during World War II, when Black soldiers were in combat during World War II against Nazism and racism. So he gave this speech. The owners politely applauded, and not surprisingly, nothing happened. But it got in the news, and they kept it in the public eye, and people were aware of this injustice. This is a photo of the Mayday Parade in New York in one of the 1940s, where Union members and lefties, radicals, marched in their baseball uniforms. Some of them were veterans of the war, and they wore their military uniforms, and they had these signs, "Admit Negroes to Big League Baseball." They also would picket in front of Yankee Stadium and the Polo Grounds where the Giants played, and Ebbets Field where the Dodgers played. They even came out here to LA, some of their colleagues here in LA, and they picketed Wrigley Field, which was the minor league stadium where the minor league Los Angeles Angels played before the Angels became a major league team. So this was a really broad movement. Another part of this movement was a guy named Bill Veeck, who owned a minor league team called the Milwaukee Brewers before they were a major league team. And he insisted that spring training in Florida be racially integrated, even though Florida was a segregated Jim Crow state. And he once went down to Florida during spring training, and he sat in the black section of the stadium, and the mayor of the town and the police chief came out to the outfield and said, "You got to move, you got to leave. You can't have a white person sitting in the segregated section of the ballpark." And he said, "If you make me move, then I will announce that our team is leaving this town. We're not going to have our spring training here anymore," which was very lucrative for the local businesses. And I'll tell all the other owners about this. And he might have been bluffing, but it worked because they left him alone, and he kept sitting in the black section for the rest of the spring training. And later, a couple years later, when he owned the Cleveland Indians, he brought Larry Doby onto the Indians, the first black player in the American League, about 2 months after Jackie Robinson was on the Dodgers. So those of you that are from Pasadena, and I know there are people on this call that are not from here, but know about Brookside Park, which is right next to the Rose Bowl. And during World War II, the Chicago White Sox held their spring training at Brookside Park, and this is an old photo that I dug up of their playing at Brookside Park. And thanks to Wendell Smith and other black newspapers, including the black newspaper here in Los Angeles, there's a lot of agitation for the White Sox and other teams to give tryouts to black players. They mostly refused. But because it was the war, because there was a lot of civil rights agitation at the time, the White Sox felt obliged to at least give a kind of fake tryout to black players. And the two players they picked were Jackie Robinson, who was from Pasadena, and who at the time was playing professional football actually in Hawaii, and Nate Moreland, who was Pasadena, grew up here, and went to Chapman College, and later played in the Negro Leagues. And so they gave Robinson and Moreland a tryout at Brookside Field. And according to all the reports, they did a great job. This is an article about it in the Pittsburgh Courier on May 21st, 1942. It was not covered in the Los Angeles Times, but it was covered in the black papers. And they did a great job during the tryout. And The manager of the White Sox, Jimmy Dykes, said he'd love to have them on the team, but I can't because you're black. And they never heard from them again. The same thing happened a couple years later when the Red Sox reluctantly gave a tryout to Jackie Robinson and two other Negro League players, Sam Jethro and Marvin Williams, because Isidore Muchnick, who was a lefty and Jewish member of the city council in Boston, said to the owner of the Red Sox, I will take away your permit to play as a city council to play on Sunday, because they had laws against selling liquor and having public events on Sunday back in 1945. He said, I'm going to withdraw those permits. And Sunday, of course, was the biggest day for the Red Sox and every other major league team in terms of attendance. So again, the Red Sox gave a tryout to these three black players, and they performed extraordinarily well, but they never heard from the Red Sox again. And the Red Sox turned out to be the last major league team to have a black player. Jackie Robinson came on in 1947. The first black player on the Red Sox was a guy named Pumpsie Green, who didn't show up until 1959, 12 years later. One of my favorite stories in the book, another sort of invisible hero, is this guy named Sam Nahum, who I know more about than I should, because I just got obsessed with him. He was grew up in Brooklyn. He was born in 1950. He grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He was a Syrian Jew. His first language was Arabic, and he grew up in this kind of Syrian Jewish ghetto in Brooklyn, and he hated it. He wanted to get out of there. He went to Brooklyn College, where he was not only the star quarterback on the football team and the star pitcher on the baseball team, but he also joined the Communist Party during the Depression and became a radical, very much in favor of integration. He played in the major leagues for a couple of years, played the minor leagues for a couple of years. He was an okay pitcher, not great, but he was okay. But in terms of our book, his claim to fame is that during World War II, he was sent to France. And after the Germans surrendered in 1945, all the military bases in France started baseball teams because there were so many great players from the major leagues, the minor leagues, college, and semi-pro teams that were in the military. And they had these incredible leagues, and they played each other. And there was something called the Military European World Series, where the teams were eventually going to play for the championship. So Sam Nahum was asked to start a team in this little town in France called Oise. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, actually. It's O-I-S-E, in France. And the military and the baseball teams in 1945 and the American bases were segregated. But because of his personal principles, he recruited two black players to be on his team. One of them was Leon Day, and another one was Willard Brown, both of them big stars in the Negro Leagues. So he had the only black players on an American military team. And even though his team was mostly, there they are, the two black players on the right there. Even though he had a kind of ragtag group of people on his team, he was able to win the championship of the European Military World Series against, get this, against a team that was sponsored by General Patton. General Patton, George Patton, was so powerful in the military that he rigged the game so that he recruited 7 big major league stars to play on his military team who were in the military. So everybody thought that Patton's team was going to defeat Nahum's team by a wide margin. Well, it went to 5 games. That was what it was a 5-game series, and it was tied 2-2. And they played the 5th and final game, get this, at Nuremberg Stadium in Germany, which is where Hitler had some of his biggest rallies. And when the Germans surrendered, the American military got the prisoners of war, the German prisoners of war, to build a baseball field inside Nuremberg Stadium, and they renamed the stadium Soldiers Field instead of Nuremberg Stadium. And the story is that in the 5th game, Sam Nahum and his team with a Jewish communist and two black players beat General Patton's team and won the Military World Series. I think that would make a great movie. And actually, a couple of filmmakers, having read my book and read some things I wrote about Sam Haven, have actually contacted me about the possibility of telling this story. Everybody loves the fact that the final game was in Nuremberg Stadium. If anybody's ever seen the documentary film Triumph of the Will by the German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, which is basically an ode to Hitler, that all takes place in Nuremberg Stadium. Jackie Robinson was a great player. Made he won the Rookie of the Year award. He won the Most Valuable Player award. But he understood more than a lot of people, including today, that he owed his success in Major League Baseball to this movement for civil rights that took place long before he was a professional player, that began in the early 1930s. He knew that he owed a debt to this movement. And so he repaid that debt many times while he was a player, as an outspoken athlete in favor of racial justice and integration. And after his career was over, when he was constantly traveling around the country, joining picket lines, raising money for bail for the students that were arrested during the sit-ins at the lunch counters, speaking out against racial injustice, recruiting other major league players, black and white, to join him in this movement. He repaid that debt through his own activism many times over. There's an important aspect of this story about racial justice in baseball that is often missing. I don't know if I uncovered it, but I haven't seen much about it written. In 1968, after Dr. King was murdered in April 1968, you saw these headlines in American newspapers. Baseball postpones its traditional opener, the opening day, in honor of Dr. King. And the headline and the first paragraph of the story in this paper says, baseball traditional openers at Washington and Cincinnati on Monday were postponed yesterday out of respect for Dr. King. Well, that's not what really happened. What happened is that Roberto Clemente, Maury Wills, Dave Wickersham, and Don Clendenin, who were players on the Pirates, got together and said, we are not going to play opening day, which is the same day as Dr. King's funeral, or the next day. And so they had a meeting of their team, and unanimously the Pirates agreed that they would basically not play that day. They were supposed to play the Houston Astros in Houston. And so these four guys went into the hotel where the Houston Astros, or wherever the Houston Astros were living, and they talked to them and said, we're not going to play. We hope you won't play. And the Houston Astros, the black and white players, agreed not to play. And so they basically had a strike, and the word spread. And all the baseball games for 2 days were canceled because the players went on strike. This was the first strike in baseball. And if you read the headlines, it said the Pirates won't play Houston on Monday. It said Negro Pirates won't play on Houston on Monday. But it was an interracial movement and an interracial strike, and it wasn't because of the benevolence of the owners or the baseball commissioner. It's because the players insisted that they had to honor Dr. King that way. So that leads to the next part of the talk, which is mostly found in our book, Major League Rebels, Not Baseball Rebels, about baseball's labor wars. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but here's a figure in baseball history that probably most people never heard of, John Montgomery Ward, one of the greatest players in the 1880s. He also had a law degree from Columbia. He wrote a book. He was the manager of one of his teams. And back then, the owners of the major teams in what was then called the National League would routinely lower their salaries. They had to pay for their own uniforms. They had to pay for their own food when they were traveling. They had to pay to wash their uniforms. They were treated really awfully. And this was in the 1880s. the Civil War had only been over for a decade and a half. And he wrote an article in a major national magazine saying that he thought baseball players were treated like chattel slavery, which was an incredibly controversial thing to say back then. And so he and some of his fellow players, these guys, O'Rourke, Keefe, and Baldwin among them, who were also supportive of the larger labor movement that was happening back in the 1880s and 1890s, which is called the Gilded Age in America, where big corporate, what they're called robber barons, were ripping off the society. People like Andrew Carnegie and people like that, John Rockefeller. They said we need to organize, just like the steel workers are doing, just like the other workers, the miners are doing. We need to organize a union. And so Montgomery Ward, O'Rourke, Keefe, and Baldwin led in organizing the first professional athletes union in the history of the country in the late 1800s. And when the owners refused to negotiate with them, they started their own league called the Players League. And 2/3 of the players in the National League jumped their teams and moved into the Players League. And so for a year, there was a cooperatively owned, player-owned league that changed all the rules of the game in terms of how people could be traded and treated and paid. There's a lot of it in our book. I won't go into a lot of detail. It only lasted a year because they ran out of money, even though they were outdrawing the National League. And so they wound up, most of them going back and playing in the National League. But it was the first inkling of something that would later become a big part of American sports and labor history. A similar thing happened after World War II, when a guy named Jorge Pascal, a millionaire Mexican who owned a lot of different businesses in Mexico, started the Mexican League to compete with the American and National Leagues. This was around 1944, 1945. He even tried to get Babe Ruth to come and manage. That's the picture there. That didn't work out, but Babe Ruth did come down to Mexico to do some publicity. I'm sure that Jorge Pascal paid him a lot of money to do that. So basically, a bunch of something like 30 major leaguers jumped over to the Mexican League because they offered them like twice the salaries and easier working conditions. And one of them was a guy named Danny Gardella, who was an outfielder for the New York Giants in the late 40s after World War II. And he jumped to the Mexican League and he made twice as much money. But then after a year, he got homesick. He was from New York. He wanted to come back. And the commissioner of baseball told him, you can't come back. And he put a ban on any player who jumped to the Mexican League to come back and play in the major leagues, the American major leagues, for 5 years. And Danny Gardella thought that was a violation of his workers' rights and civil rights as an individual who should be able to work wherever he wants if somebody wants to have him. And so he sued Major League Baseball. And he got other people to support the suit. He filed suit against what was called the Reserve Clause, which tethered players to their teams. And he sued against this blacklist. And the owners of Major League Baseball were worried that he would win the lawsuit because it was a clear violation of his rights. And so, and he couldn't afford, he was from a working class family, he couldn't afford, this is before there was a union of players, he couldn't afford to pay a lawyer to keep his suit going. And so he settled for $60,000. If he'd been able to afford to continue the lawsuit, he probably would have won. And the reserve clause in baseball would have ended in 1948 or 49 or 1950. But it didn't. Instead, but he was, before Curt Flood challenged Major League Baseball over the reserve clause, this guy Danny Gardella did. Not many people have ever heard of him. In 1965, two of the greatest players on the LA Dodgers, Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax, the two best pitchers in the majors at the time, asked for an increase in their salary. The Dodgers wouldn't give them what they wanted. And so they basically went on strike during spring training. And eventually the Dodgers caved in and gave them what they wanted. They weren't trying to start a union. They were just basically saying, look, we have leverage here. And that was a real eye opener for all the other ball players in America, in the major leagues, that these two stars could basically leverage their stardom. And people started saying, well, if they can do it, if we organize together, maybe the players can improve their working conditions. Back in 1965, the average player in major leagues made about $5,000 a year, which is the equivalent of, I think, about $50,000 or $60,000 today. Nothing close to the astronomical salaries that most of them have now. And so Robin Roberts and Jim Bunning, two of the great pitchers in the 1960s, recruited a guy named Marvin Miller, who'd been an economist and a negotiator with the Steelworkers Union, to become the first head of the Major League Baseball Players Association in 1966. And he got the first collective bargaining agreement signed by Major League Baseball against the will of all the owners. But, you know, he was very smart, and he taught the players about their rights and so forth. And then 3 years later, after he joined the union in 1969, Curt Flood, who's a star player for the St. Louis Cardinals, you can see in both the left and the right. He was traded from the Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies, and he didn't want to go. He lived in St. Louis. His family was there. He had a side business as an artist and a painter. He didn't want to go, and so he said, "I may be making a lot of money." He made $90,000 back in 1969, but he called himself a well-paid slave. He didn't like the fact that he could be sold as a piece of property against his will to another team. And so he sued Major League Baseball, and Marvin Miller said to him, the head of the players union, "If you sue Major League Baseball, you'll never play again. You'll be blacklisted." He said, "Well, I think it's the right thing to do, and if I have to be a sacrificial lamb for this principle, I will." And so we sued Major League Baseball. It went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Supreme Court ruled against him in 1972 by 5-3 on the grounds that baseball was not a business, that it was entertainment, and therefore they were exempt from the federal antitrust laws, and the reserve clause could stay, tethering all the players to their teams who own them. So he lost the suit, but he educated the players that this was a possibility, and he did get blacklisted. He never played again, and the rest of his life is sort of sad. But he stood up for principle. He was kind of the Rosa Parks of baseball in some ways. And so 3 years later, Marvin Miller, who had won for the players the right to arbitrate their salaries, brought the reserve clause to arbitration. And much to people's surprise, the arbitrator actually ruled in favor of the players in 1975. And that was the end of the reserve clause. And that's when you began to see baseball salaries, working conditions, spring training facilities, medical facilities, and others improve dramatically. There's a section of Baseball Rebels about the gender revolution in baseball. I'm going to talk very, very briefly. You can read about it. Women have been playing baseball. I don't mean softball, I mean baseball, since the 1860s, when the first women's colleges were started: Smith, Mount Holyoke, Sarah Lawrence, most of them in the East. And there were some great players. Alta Weiss was a great pitcher who wound up barnstorming around the country and playing against male teams and doing very well. The woman in the middle is a woman named Lizzie Murphy, who did the same thing. One of the great stories in the book is a woman on the right named Jackie Mitchell. She was signed as a pitcher for a minor league team in Chattanooga, Tennessee, called the Chattanooga Lookouts. This was a male minor league team in 1931. And they played an exhibition game against the powerful New York Yankees that season. And she struck out both Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, the two most fearsome hitters in Major League Baseball at the time. And there she is with Ruth and Gehrig. And people thought it was a stunt, but Ruth and Gehrig actually struck out. In response to that, there were stories all over the country, headlines: girl strikes out Ruth and Gehrig. In response to that, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner of baseball, basically voided her contract with the Chattanooga Lookouts and banned women from ever playing in baseball. And that wasn't rescinded until 1992. There still haven't been women playing Major League Baseball, but it's a possibility, as I'll talk about in a second. All of you have probably seen the film League of Their Own. The League of Their Own was based on a real story of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. There's Gina Davis on the right, the star catcher in the film. Her character was based in part on this woman on the left named Helen Callahan, who was sort of the Ted Williams of the Women's League. She's the mother of a friend of mine named Kelly Candell, who's a writer here in LA, and also the mother of Kelly's younger brother, Casey Candell, who was a player in the major leagues for 10 years. And he's now a coach for the Toronto Blue Jays. He and his mother, Casey, and his mother, Helen, are the only mother-son combination to play professional baseball. So the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was started in 1943 because so many male players in major leagues were in the war that some of the owners thought that they wouldn't, fans wouldn't go to the games to see third-rate players playing in the majors. So they started this women's league that played in small cities in the Midwest. And these were some of the great players on that team. And one of the unknown aspects of that league was that there were a lot of lesbians in the league, but they were all in the closet, at least to the public, because the league wanted to make sure that people thought that the players on the league were these all-American girls, the girl next door, the girl you wanted your son to marry. And so they did whatever they could to make sure that the lesbians on the team were deeply in the closet. They made all of the players take makeup classes and social graces classes and so forth to learn how to look like the all-American girls. They made them play in skirts rather than regular uniforms, which was very dangerous when they were sliding into second or third base. And there was a movie made a couple of years ago about one of these players that came out who came out of the closet. Most of them didn't come out of the closet until they died, when their obituaries came out. But an interesting thing happened a couple of weeks ago. I was up in Rochester, New York, to go visit a friend of mine, and I went to see a minor league game in Rochester, and they had women's night there, and they invited a woman named Maybelle Blair, who had played in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. She's now 95 years old. And she threw out the first ball at this minor league game. And I met her there. And I said hi to her. I told her about my book and I gave her a copy of it. Then I went back here, came home to LA. And like 2 weeks ago, I read a story in the newspaper that Maybelle Blair, 95 years old, came out of the closet for the first time. And you can just look her up, Maybelle Blair. And she told her story about how she'd been in the closet all her life, including when she was playing on this team. There were Black women that played baseball, but they weren't allowed in either the major leagues or the women's league, the All-American Girls Baseball League. So they wound up playing in the Negro Leagues. So there were these three women, we tell their story in the book, Baseball Rebels, who played in the Negro Leagues. And the one on the right, Connie Morgan, is there with Jackie Robinson. We tell the story of 10, 11, 12-year-old girls in the 1970s who sued to play Little League Baseball, which banned girls until the 1970s. And the woman in the middle is a judge who ruled in favor of girls playing Little League Baseball when several of them sued the Little Leagues for the right to play, particularly after Title IX was passed. This is a photo of Moan Davis, who is an African-American young girl who pitched in the Little League World Series. And she's now playing baseball. She then played baseball in college. And she's now playing professional baseball. Ella Borders, who's from Southern California, was the first woman to ever get a scholarship to play college baseball in the early 2000s. She wrote a book which you can read, and about her life and her career. She also was in the closet and came out after she hung up her spikes. She's now a firefighter. But for 5 years, she played professional baseball on all men's teams in the minor leagues. She wasn't good enough to climb up the ladder and make it into the majors, but she was a real pioneer and somebody that most people have never heard of. There are women now who've been Claire Smith is one of the great women sports writers. Pam Postuma sued Major League Baseball because she was an umpire in the minors in the Pacific Coast League. That's the thing she has on her shirt there, Pacific Coast League. But she was never promoted to the majors, even though people thought she was good enough to play in the majors, to be an umpire in the majors. This season, there's a woman who's a Major League first base coach on the Giants. And Kelsey Whitmore, about 3 months ago, was got a contract to play for the Staten Island Ferry Hawks, which is a minor league team in New York City. So someday we will probably see a woman playing Major League Baseball. We already know that there's a woman general manager, and there's a minor league manager, Rachel Balkovec, who began managing a minor league team in Florida this season. I'm almost done. There have been 20,000 players in the major leagues since the year 1900. Not one of them has come out of the closet. But these two guys, Glenn Burke and Billy Beane, came out of the closet after they hung up their spikes and retired. Glenn Burke's is a sort of tragic story. Billy Beane's is less so. Glenn Burke died of AIDS. Billy Beane in 1999 came out of the closet after he retired from baseball. And a couple years ago, he was appointed the vice president of Major League Baseball for inclusion and diversity. And part of his job is to encourage Major League Baseball to be more open to gay players and gay fans. And I interviewed him for the book. He thinks there will be an openly gay Major League player, or more than one, hopefully, sometime in the next decade, maybe even earlier than that. There have been out of the closet gay players in the minor leagues, including these guys. The guy in the middle is now playing in the minor leagues, and he's out of the closet. So someday that'll happen. So someday, maybe my children will see, or maybe even I'll see, a gay player and a woman player in Major League Baseball. There have been two in the closet Major League umpires, Dale Scott and Dave Pallone. Dave Pallone wrote a book about it. Dale Scott has a new book about it. What it was like being an in the closet umpire. In Dave Pallone's book, which came out about 15 years ago, he said that he knew enough gay players in the major leagues to form a team, but they were all in the closet. I'm going to skip this part, except to point out that one of the great unsung heroes of baseball in America is this guy, Kenichi Zenemura, who was a great baseball player, Japanese American, about whom there's this book, who created baseball teams in the internment camps during World War II to help boost morale among the Japanese Americans who were thrown into them. These were players that came out against the war in Vietnam. Some more, I tell their stories. Carlos Delgado refused to sing the national anthem, or God Bless America, because of the U.S. bombing of an island outside of Puerto Rico named Iraquis. They were doing nuclear testing, and he also was against the war in Iraq. I'll skip that story unless you want to ask me about it. And I'll skip the story of Cuban players in the United States who went back to Cuba to play in Cuba, players that supported the Nicaraguan and El Salvadorian revolutions. I'll skip that. And I'll just talk about a few players in modern day baseball. Adrian Gonzalez played for the Dodgers. Dexter Fowler, Brandon McCarthy, who, when Trump was elected president, made fairly bold statements against Trump and his immigration policies and other things. During the World Series, Adrian Gonzalez refused to stay at a Trump hotel and where the team is supposed to stay. And reporters asked him, why aren't you staying? He said, ask the president. These two players, when the Houston Astros won the World Series in 2017, refused to go to the White House for the ceremony with Trump. And this was true of NFL players, NBA players, the Boston Red Sox the next year when they won the World Series, the Washington Nationals when they won the World Series. There have been players when Trump was president who won the World Series who were supposed to go to this ceremonial event at the White House, and they refused to go, and they were outspoken about it. During the Black Lives Matter protests after the killings of George Floyd and others, some players, including Mookie Betts, took a knee. The first one to do that was Bruce Maxwell, the catcher for the Oakland A's. And you can see his teammate, Mark Kanya, not quite ready to take a knee, but showing his solidarity with his teammate by putting his hand on his shoulder. Sean Doolittle, the pitcher for now the Washington Nationals, was another one. And Mookie Betts and the manager of the Giants, Gabe Kapler. So I want to end with a couple of things that are sort of egregious injustices in baseball today that ought to be dealt with. One is that Curt Flood, who I mentioned earlier, should be in the Hall of Fame, not only because he was a great player for 10 or 11 years in the majors. He was an all-star. He won the Gold Glove as the best center fielder. He had a lifetime batting average close to 300. He's a great base stealer. But because of his sacrifice and his principles and how his challenge to the baseball establishment over the reserve clause deserves to be recognized in Cooperstown, the Hall of Fame. Major League Baseball uses about 2 million baseballs a year during the spring training and during the season and the postseason. And they're all made in this one factory called the Rawlings Factory in a little town in Costa Rica. And you can see the photograph on the right of the factory. The workers in that factory get carpal tunnel syndrome and have severe injuries because of the nature of the work, the sewing of the baseball. And when their bodies give out after working there for a number of years, they get fired. They could slow down the pace of the work. They could hire more workers to do that. Instead, the Rawlings factory exploits them. 4 years ago, Major League Baseball bought a 25% share of this factory. And so Major League Baseball owns a sweatshop in Costa Rica. And I've been trying to get the players union to take some players down to Costa Rica to do a site visit, which would then generate a lot of media attention about this incredible injustice. At Major League Baseball, 24 of the 30 owners of Major League Baseball are all billionaires. And they own this sweatshop in Costa Rica that provides the symbol of the game, the baseball itself. The minor leagues need to be unionized because the conditions in the minor leagues among players are really awful. I don't know if Bill Fletcher is on the call here. He told me he might try to get on it, but he's one of the leaders, the union activist, to try to organize the minor league players to start a union. But they did sue Major League Baseball a couple of years ago over paying less than the minimum wage, over their housing conditions, their mental health issues, and so forth. And literally last week, on July 15th, Major League Baseball agreed to pay a $185 million settlement because they knew they were going to lose the lawsuit. But they still need to be unionized. The final slide is going back to Jackie Robinson in Pasadena. Jackie Robinson grew up in Pasadena. He went to Muir High School. He went to Pasadena Community College. Then he went to UCLA. His house was on Pepper Street in Northwest Pasadena. In the 1970s, they tore down the Robinson house where he'd lived since 1922 when his family moved to Pasadena when he was less than 2 years old from Georgia. His house was torn down during urban renewal, and the site was vacant until they built this new house on the left, long after the Robinsons had moved out, that is still there at the same address, basically, at 121 to 123 Pepper Street. To honor Jackie Robinson, the city put down this disgustingly small plaque facing the wrong way. It actually faces inward towards the house. It says Jackie Robinson resided on this site with his family from 1922 to 1946. So for the last couple of months, I've been working with a city council member here in Pasadena named John Kennedy, who represents that part of Pasadena on the city council, to try to get the city to erect a sign similar to the one on the right on a pole where people can actually see it, as opposed to having to know that it's there and get out of your car and look on the sidewalk. That is a sign in front of the house where Jackie Robinson was born in Cairo, Georgia. He left Cairo, Georgia when he was about 15 months old. And still the people of Cairo, Georgia decided that he was famous enough to deserve having that site honored with this sign. And I think Pasadena should do the same thing. It should say something similar to what's on the sign. And so hopefully in the next year, if you drive down Pepper Street, you can take tourists and others there, you will see a sign like this in front of his house. And so that brings me full circle to the end of my talk. Started with Jackie Robinson and it ends with Jackie Robinson. So I'm now, thank you for your attention. I hope you'll buy the books. And I'm happy to answer any questions that Christine can ask me from the chat. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for a fabulous detailed program. It was absolutely wonderful. Your photos, your history, the information that we all learned is just phenomenal. So I do encourage everyone to get your books. As I said, they're available at the library and you can purchase them from Vroman's and read up more about Peter's books and the information in them. So this was a fabulously detailed program. There is a question. What are thoughts on banning people like Pete Rose from baseball? And your thoughts on the Astros cheating and keeping their World Series win against the Dodgers?
All right, well, these are opinions that I have that, a lot of people probably don't share. I don't think Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame because he gambled against the rules, which were against the rules at the time. And then he lied about it. He's still lying about it. And he was a great player by the numbers. He deserves to be there. The rebuttal to that is if people who had bad character were kept out of the Hall of Fame would be basically empty. Because there's a lot of, racists and retrobates and awful people that are in the Hall of Fame. But we can't always live by the standards of the past. We need to live by the standards of the present. So he broke the rules. Now, what's ironic, of course, is now baseball, Major League Baseball, has officially embraced gambling, right? If you watch any baseball game, you'll see ads, and they make a lot of money from online gambling. So it is ironic, but I don't think that Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame. And in terms of the Houston Astros cheating and holding on to their World Series Cup, there's been a lot of cheating in Major League Baseball. It doesn't make it right. They got caught. That doesn't make it right either. So I actually don't know how I feel about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Someone is saying that it's an absolutely amazing program. They're listening in from New York City, and they hope to have a link to this talk so she can share it with numerous baseball players. And you can see Martha waving her hand just a few minutes ago. So yes, it is going to be recorded to YouTube Pasadena Library. It will take about a week for us to pull it down from the cloud and put it on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much to Peter for allowing us to record this wonderful program. So much detailed information, absolutely wonderful. And someone wants us to print the titles of your books so that they can purchase them. Let me do that for you right now. You're going back to the,
Yeah, I'll make it easy for you.
okay, you're going back to the very beginning where there was the wonderful covers of the books.
Okay, take another 2 seconds here.
Baseball Rebels, the players, people, and social movements that shook up the game and changed America. And Major League Rebels, baseball battles over workers' right and American empire. But if you don't remember all these titles and you go to the Pasadena Public Library, all you have to remember is the author, Peter Dreier.
And if you live in Pasadena or if you live in the LA area, Vroman's bookstore has it. Or you can order them online from either the publishers, or you can just, from, I'd encourage people not to use Amazon, but to use bookshop.com or some other independent bookstores like Vroman's. But if it makes you feel comfortable shopping at Amazon, you can get these books from Amazon as well.
So there's another question. Where can I see Moses Fleet Walker's Our Home Colony?
That's a really good question. I don't think the book is still, so Moses Walker was the last African-American to play Major League Baseball until Jackie Robinson because of the segregation in the 1880s. And he wrote this book as a civil rights activist about the fate of blacks in America called The Home Colony. He thought that American blacks ought to move to Africa, or long before a guy named Marcus Garvey had the same idea. So he wrote this book called Home Colony, and I don't know whether, I don't think it's still in print. So you're going to have to go to a library and get a copy of it to read it.
Right. You can go to a library and go to ask for interlibrary loan, and then they can send it out and search throughout the United States. And it'll depend upon where it's coming from. There might be a small fee, and it depends upon where you live. And they search throughout the United States, and chances are you'll get the book. Interlibrary loan. It's a wonderful opportunity for you.
Great. Any other questions?
Any other questions? This was just a fabulous, fabulous program. I just know you all enjoyed it, and we can't thank Peter enough for participating in our summer One City, One Story program about baseball, featuring the book Stealing Home by Eric Nussbaum. If you would like a copy of that book, there are still some available at the Lamanda Park Library that you can go get a free copy.
But by the way, Stealing Home is this book by Eric Nussbaum. It's a story of how the community of Chavez Ravine in downtown Los Angeles was destroyed by urban renewal and by LA politics, and eventually became the site of Dodger Stadium. But he goes back several generations, interviews people back in Mexico, where people came from to live there. He interviews the children and grandchildren of the people who were displaced by the urban renewal bulldozer. And he talks to some of the politicians. It reads like a novel. It's a wonderful history. And Eric interviewed me, and if you Google both of our names, you can probably find it online. He interviewed me about my book for some similar book talk presentation. But I really recommend Stealing Home. It's an amazing book, and it's written like a novel. So you will love it. You'll eat it up.
He talks about there is a school underneath the baseball field at the stadium that was just they just bulldozed it over, and it's still there, the building underneath it. So every time I watch a game, I think of that part of his book, his description of it. So it's called it's Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and those caught in between. And it is by Eric Nussbaum, Nussbaum. So are there any other questions for Peter? We thank him very, very much for an excellent program today.
It's my pleasure.
So thank you very much. A big round of applause for you. And remember, you can revisit and enjoy this program again and share it with your friends on YouTube Pasadena Library. Come to Pasadena Library and check out the books, or go to Vroman's bookstore and purchase the 2 books for yourself or your family. Thank you so much again. Good
Okay.
night.
Night.